Far from improving the situation for Australian creatives, this legislation contains one particular section that on our side we will not be supporting, and that is undermining the existing content quotas that exist for pay television services. And the reason it's so important that these are not halved, which is what this legislation will do, is because we need, as the member for Cowper said, we do need to see Australian stories on our screens. But this piece of legislation is not going to make that happen. In fact, it will undermine it significantly. When I grew up as a kid in the 1960s, there wasn't a lot of Australian content. There was no government support at that time for Australian film and television. There was no real Australian screen industry. In 1961, it was something like 1% of drama on TV was Australian drama. The other 99% was foreign. And that only changed when in the 1970s there were decisions made to support the Australian television industry. And there were actually marches in the 70s demanding local content quotas. That's where it started. And it was as a direct result of that that we started to see Australian stories more and more on our screens. So by the time my kids were born in the 90s and watching television, they were able to see Australian stories, a lot of Australian stories, everything from Blinky Bill, The Adventures of Blinky Bill, through to Bananas in Pyjamas, all the great Aussie, for them, kids stuff. And then as they've grown, they've been able to really be nurtured and nourished by absolute quality Australian drama on our screens. Now, the devices on which we watch these things have changed, but Australian drama remains one of the few things that allows us to see who we are in the myriad of genres that it's there. You know, I don't know if it was watching Australian drama that was one of the reasons, but I have a daughter who's an actor. She wants to tell Australian stories. And I despair when I see legislation like this that will hit people in the industry, people who for the last year have seen things dry up. There's foreign productions here, they're hiring people, but they're not telling Australian stories. Very few of them. They're telling international stories. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't be making our stories head overseas. I remember in 1988 living in New York, and of course that was the era of Crocodile Dundee, and our Australian story, one of our Australian stories, was being well and truly told across the United States then. So we should be ambitious, we should be trying to share our stories with the world, but we should not, and we will not on this side, be supporting legislation that makes it harder for those stories to even get made. What we have here is a piecemeal approach to adapting to the changing platforms that we're facing. You know, whether it's people watching on iPads, whether it's streaming, whether it is the changes that are affecting pay TV, none of those things should be dealt with in isolation. And unfortunately, this is what the government's been doing time and time again, ever since it first talked about trying to bring our laws into the more modern environment. I think that was 4 years ago that they started talking about it. Yet here we are, 2021, and we're getting little bits of stuff happening along the way. The reduction in expenditure required by subscription television broadcasting licences on new eligible drama expenditure, dropping that from 10% to 5%, which is what this legislation contains, will, according to the creatives who live in my electorate of Macquarie, covering the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, and there are many creatives who use the mountains and call the mountains home, for them it's a death knell on their industry. And that's not just actors and directors, that's writers, that's set designers, that's graphic designers, the whole ecosystem, the composers who write the music, the ecosystem of creatives that are involved in getting something from someone's concept in their head onto a screen. and that we cannot support this. We'll support every other thing in this legislation. But as the member for Greenway has moved, we are moving an amendment to excise this particular section of the bill. When I look at the bill and this part of it, it really highlights the ongoing failure and this delay that the government has created when it comes to supporting Australian stories on our screens. I also, in some of the other bits, the legislation we're being asked to pass here around journalism and public interest journalism highlights a failure, and I will speak about that a bit later. But basically a failure to get media reform in all its elements right. So, while we won't stand in the way of changes to captioning rules, the digital radio channel plans, the regional commercial radio licensees or the time frame for ACMA to make grants to regional journalism, we will not be supporting the halving of Foxtel's Australian screen content obligation without any new requirements being put in its place. I want to take you in more detail to these screen content rules and just think about the timeline that we've had since 2017. So the minister, very boldly, Minister Fifield it was at the time, announced a broad-ranging and comprehensive review of Australian and children's content. And this was a review that would identify sustainable policies to ensure the ongoing availability of Australian and children's content to domestic and international audiences, regardless of platform. Now, that was a very noble ambition, and I wish that that's what we were here talking about today. But after all this time, there is nothing modernising the Australian content obligations for this contemporary media environment. The proposal in the bill to halve Foxtel's Australian screen content obligation without putting anything in its place, nothing such as requirements for streaming services like Netflix to produce Australian content, really means that when you combine it with other things that have happened, there are very few opportunities for Australian stories to be supported. If anything, this throws a wet blanket over the creativity of telling those stories. It comes on top of the recent decision to water down the Australian screen content rules for commercial free-to-air broadcasters. Now, in the middle of COVID, under the cover of COVID, the minister announced the changes to drama, documentary and children's content, the sub-quota, on commercial TV. And it was interesting that those changes did not come to the parliament, but they were made by ACMA at the direction of the minister. Now, those same sub-quotas were then suspended as the emergency COVID measure and then reintroduced in a watered-down form from the 1st of July. At that time, we said that the changes would mean fewer Australian stories and fewer job opportunities for local creators. Let me tell you excuse me. Let me tell you what one of my constituents said about that change, about the plans to scrap quotas for local drama and children's programming, but I will just pause momentarily. Here's what they say. As a writer who's worked in the local industry for the past 12 years, I know how integral the current quota system is to ensuring that Australian audiences can see new, quality content that both entertains and informs. Most kids' shows are put together with money from a range of sources, both here and overseas, but a local sale through one of the major broadcasters has, for every production company I've ever worked for, provided the basis upon which the remainder of the finance is then secured. Without that linchpin, the viability of local production of kids' content is very much under threat. The viability of my career as a writer and the careers of thousands of other creatives currently producing engaging and enriching screen content that sells all around the world is under threat. That's what the government did at the start of this year. That's the sort of impact that comes from decisions made by this government. The government continues to kick the can down the road on comprehensive changes, comprehensive reform. I don't think the government knows what reform is. There's just lots of tweaking around the edges, none of it being matched up with any commensurate changes. The current minister, Minister Fletcher, has failed creators and the small businesses who really make up the screen sector. And let's be clear, these are small businesses. These are small, independent operators. The people who live and work in the Blue Mountains, they have an ecosystem of their own, and their work generates work for other businesses, but they are all small. And for a party opposite that is meant to be supporting small business, you do a terrible job of supporting the creatives. I mean, and that's without even talking about how many people missed out on JobKeeper in the last 12 months. You know, it does seem there's a determination just to destroy these businesses because, for some reason, being creative should not constitute a small business. I might add that the poor quality of NBN in my region also adds to that effect. It makes it hard for people to get businesses and to get the bandwidth they need, especially the creatives, to be able to operate. The current minister, has even failed his own test on these measures because he previously announced that he would harmonise the regulatory framework and address the disparity in regulation between broadcasters and online streaming services. Now, I think at a time when the French, the German, the Canadian governments are all moving to require platforms like Netflix and Amazon to invest in local content, but there is an absolute vacuum on that issue here. That just says it all. The content rules are being dismantled effectively by this government, and it's leaving only the ABC as a body that will invest, and yet their funding is also under extraordinary pressure and being reduced. The content obligations for commercial TV are watered down, and now the halving of Foxtel's expenditure, and nothing for the streamers. So that's why we will not be supporting that component of the bill, and I support the amendment that's been moved by the member for Greenway. I just want to touch briefly in the couple of minutes I have left, on the Regional and Small Publishers Fund, which has clearly been an absolute dud in terms of supporting and helping maintain local independent journalism. And I want to draw attention to the decisions being made by ACM in my electorate, where the North Richmond printing facility is being closed. Now, that doesn't directly affect journalist jobs, but it affects the other jobs that go with that process. And it means there are many job losses. And what's more, a lot of people have been kept on casual arrangements, and they are not receiving redundancy that is commensurate with the years that they've worked, even when they've worked regular shifts, regular days for years and years and years. I have women in their 50s who have had the same shifts for decades, and yet they've been considered casuals, and they're not receiving redundancy for that time. So when I see that these sorts of publishers have been given incentives, the incentives have been the wrong incentives. They haven't achieved the outcomes that were needed, and that is independent journalism. And I say this as a former journalist, a commercial broadcaster. We need those voices. We need a multitude of voices to hold governments to account. And I don't care who's in government, that is going to be the job of journalists, but this government is getting rid of those voices, which is, for the sake of a democracy, is an appalling situation to be in. So this bill, this overall package of legislation, has many disappointments. It is disappointing that the government is having to extend and change this Regional and Small Publishers Innovation Fund. They had to change it into the Ping Fund, and now wanting to bring more changes about it. We'll support those, but we will not support a watering down of Australian content on pay TV.